Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here with another AX8 sound-alike patch. Today I want to show you how to sound like Zakk Wylde. I've been working on this particular tone match preset for the better part of 10 months since I own the AX8, working on it on and off, of course. And I've just now made a video about it because it's now to the point that I feel like it's decent enough to share. It's kind of one of those catch-22s where I'm very familiar with Zakk Wylde's tone, and because of that, I'm much more critical of myself making a patch of it. And not to say I'm not familiar with stuff like Amon Amarth and Ola Englund's tone, but with Zakk, he uses such a unique mixture of traditional instruments and gear that are just supercharged to create his signature sound. So we'll certainly get into the details of that. Before doing that though, let's talk about the guitar I'm using. So this is Wild Audio Blood Eagle, an Explorer-like guitar that is made by Zakk Wylde's Wild Audio brand, who is really manufactured by Schecter. Got a review of this if you haven't seen it. You're more than welcome to check it out. It's a 24 5/8 scale, so it's not quite 3/4, but it feels like a 24 3/4 inch scale like any other Gibson. Bare maple neck, ebony fretboard, mahogany body, most importantly, EMG 81 and 85, 81 and 85 that is. So this is the main reason, aside from the actual preset building, that I haven't made a video on it yet, because I wanted a 6-string with EMGs. And it's not the end of the world if you don't have a guitar with EMGs. It's not going to make the biggest difference, but Zakk's always used EMGs to get that flat, crunchy response. Obviously, you don't get the dynamics of a passive pickup. You also get some higher output, more consistency for your leads though. So again, if you just have a regular Gibson or Epiphone Les Paul that has the stock passive pickups, you'll be fine. And matter of fact, I'll show you a little trick that can bring that up to par with kind of the consistency of the EMGs, and you'll get a little bit of best of both worlds. Other than that, I guess we'll just jump into the patch, and I'll walk step by step of how I turn the AX8 into matching the real gear. So here is my Black Label Berserker preset in all of its linear glory, and everything is fairly self-explanatory in terms of what it is. The enhancer block, again, like usual, I just have to thicken up the sound. If you're going to use the enhancer block for like solos, or you're just playing through speakers and want to thicken it up, I would recommend the classic type. That generally gives a better stereo painting sound that sounds more like Zakk, in terms of how he double tracks guitars. So I like that effect, and I'll be keeping it on just for sake of the video. So let's just work our way down and kind of talk about each block individually. We'll keep the drive, amp, and cab on for the time being. So the wah block. This was one of the things that kept me from releasing this video for a long time, because this wah pedal has kicked my ass. Which is funny because I own the real wah pedal. I have it right here, and I'll compare it for you. But the stock models, I don't really like them. They work really well for modern stuff, and they work really well for clean stuff. But as far as like the traditional hard rock crybaby sound, I'm still not a huge fan of it, and I've not, played with it enough to really master it, I feel like. But regardless, I'm just not in love with the fractal audio interpretation of some of these pedals. But finally got to a point I feel like I'm pretty close. So here's the real wah pedal. And what you'll hear is there's not a whole lot of high frequency there, unlike on the normal crybaby pedals, especially like Slashes and some other signature models. It doesn't go very high, and that was one of the things I kept running into that I didn't really realize for a long time until I A/B tested it. I was like, what is that? You know, it's too nasally or something. And to get that throatier sound, that's where the frequency max comes in. So I dialed that down quite a bit. Same thing with the minimum. So I dialed this down to 280 from, I think, the standard's 400 or something like that. And I also experimented with the different types just to see if, even though Zakk's signature pedal here is a derivative of the Crybaby, just to see if anything else would sound good. And I ended up sticking with this. Drive at 10, I don't really know what that does. It sounds better at 10 than it does anything else, so I just kind of put it there. Fat, I believe, lets in the clean signal, so I kept that completely off, and I don't know how accurate that is or not, but tracking feels pretty good compared to the real pedal, considering it is just an expression pedal. Everything else I kept fairly, pretty much the same. So let's try out the modeled wah pedal here. I don't think it's 100% perfect, but I think more of it has to do with the way it feels while playing, more so than the sound, because of this kind of cheap expression pedal I have here. Not cheap, but it feels more like a volume pedal, and that's one downside to multi-effects units. I never like the feel for wah pedals. I'd probably end up just sticking with my own if I end up using it that way, but turned out okay, and I think it sounds better than the stock Crybaby unit for sure. So a pretty good analog or digital analog to the real Zakk Wylde pedal. So I'm happy enough with that, and keep forgetting that interrupts communication, so I'll quit doing that. I have, unlike most of the time with these patches, I put the scenes on the floorboard, so you can engage them via the switches. For this though, I've got it set up where pretty much all of these blocks, minus some of the obvious ones like turning off the cabinet, that you're able to use individually, which means that you have to dance on the pedal board, but that's what Zakk does live, so I set it up the way he would. Next in the stack is the Rotary block. That would be the Rotovibe, and he has a signature Rotovibe, which again, I still can't find the damn thing. I've been looking for one just to have. It's not something I would really use all that often, but pretty unique pedal, and it's kind of just like a time sweepable chorus effect. This is kind of what it sounds like. Having listened to Zakk's material for most of my life, there would be so many times where I'd hear some weird effect that would thicken his guitar, and I have no idea what it is. And that's what it is. It's his Rotovibe pedal. Most of the time, you would stick this in the effects loop, or in this case, after the amp block, to give a rotary speaker sound. That's kind of what you're emulating. And there's like a Fender rotary amp that's in the bass presets that does exactly that. But in this case, it sounds pretty cool to thicken up your guitar in the front of the amp here. So that's the way he uses it. The rotary going right after his wah pedal. So again, I have this tied to the same expression pedal that I'm using for the wah. Of course, if you want to make this exact, then you'd have two expression pedals and do it from that. You can also change, make it auto engage, or do it based off of the envelope of your guitar. If you want to do this, have it like automatically change, and you can do the same for the wah pedal. But in this case, I have both of them tied to an expression pedal for a little bit more accuracy. So that's the two kind of pedals, I guess you could call it. And then for the stomp boxes, we start with the phaser. In this case, he has the ZW90, and lo and behold, Script 90. It's basically exactly the bass Dunlop Phase 90 model, and is also pretty much the Van Halen Phase 90 model, which is exactly what he was using before he got his signature. And I've expressed in my review of those pedals that they sound pretty much freaking identical to me. Because of that, I pretty much left everything exactly the same, and I turned the rate to around where I've seen Zakk keep it on his pedal board. I don't know how analogous this is to the actual pedal as far as the positioning goes, but it sounds pretty right to me. And 100% mix didn't sound right, so I backed it down a little bit. You can play with that, but I find that I'm not sure exactly how the wiring is as far as, how much of that signal is mixed in with the bass signal, but I find a lot of these effects, if you put them in front of the amp block, bleed too much compared to the analog gear, which, it makes sense. You have a pure signal generator here. So this is what the phaser sounds like. This is another one of those time-based effects Zakk uses in front of the amp instead of in the effects loop, and it's kind of like his auto-wah in this case, not Ottawa, Canada, like the auto-wah stomp box. But he uses it, again, to thicken up solos, just get a different time-based effect. Also uses it on some clean stuff, sounds pretty good. I know, like Crazy Horse, he opens up with that. So that goes before the drive pedal. You can flip-flop them around and see how you like them. But this is the way Zakk has his pedal board. Of course, it's actually right to left instead of left to right because that's the way real pedals run. But regardless, that's the phaser pedal. Drive pedal. This one is very important, so you can't say Zakk Wylde without Overdrive. And for this one, instead of trying to model his signature Dunlop pedal, conveniently, there is a Boss Super Overdrive model in here, which is what he used to use before he got his signature Wylde Overdrive in sometime early 2000s, whatever that was. But they're practically the same pedal. You have some tonal differences, but they're really limited. I think there's even more tonal difference between the newer Berserker Overdrive than between the Wylde Overdrive and, the Super OD. So you could play with the low cut and high cut frequencies if this doesn't do it for your particular guitar. But for me, this sounds pretty much dead on. So turn the phaser off here. And the drive tone and level is what we're going to want to mess with here. That's what mimics the real pedal controls. I didn't touch anything in advance, just looking at this. Level is not at 10, which is unusual for me for these heavy metal rock guitar sounds. I usually crank level, drive at 0, tone at 10, and that's how I get my clean boost sound on tube screamers and the like. But for this instance, Zakk distorts these input of his amplifier. So instead of just, giving more signal, more of that clean signal to the amp, he's actually pushing the front end of the preamp a little bit, which, gives him that chug and crunch that he is so synonymous with. But because of that, it gets a little noisy in high frequency, so he actually rolls off on the tone. And of course, with these EMG pickups, it's not a big deal, so you can still retain plenty of tonal characteristics that way. And this is what it sounds like with and without. If I were a betting man, I would guess that these parameters were changed between albums, because stuff like 1919 Eternal sounds super crushing. It's still a very thick guitar sound, but it's very defined as well on many of those songs. And I don't know how much of that is microphone placement or the specific cabinet and studio they were using, but I would imagine some of this was changed, and you can play with that. I also play with some of the parameters on the amp depending on what sound I'm going for, so don't be discouraged if you aren't getting the definition you think you should be. You can always mess with some of these parameters, and I'm sure you're not going to be far off from the way he actually used them. I would say this is pretty close for a lot of his early live stuff, though, because what was the live album? It was something like Booze, Bruise, and something else. But this gets a very similar chunky guitar sound to that. So Super OD, pretty much the same thing as his Wylde Overdrive. For the chorus, this is something I didn't touch a whole lot of either. Kept the rate, a lot of this stuff fairly similar. The mix is rather low because, again, this thickens up really, really nicely in front of the amp, so you don't need a whole lot there. And really just played with the different parameters that would match on the Zakk Wylde chorus, which, again, is pretty much a ripoff of a baseline Dunlop chorus. Before that, he was using some type of Boss stereo chorus, but I think he was only using the mono out anyway, so if he was using stereo, he was going to two different amplifiers doing like a wet, dry, wet. So for the sake of this works. You can do stereo if you want, but it was in front of the amplifier, so it didn't really matter. So again, that's kind of matched everything there. I didn't play with anything here. Maybe the low cut, but I don't think I did. I think I kept it fairly stock because it sounded pretty close. But the low cut and high cut is on the actual pedal as well, so. Yet again, this is another time-based effect that Zakk uses in front of the amp for a different kind of wet guitar sound. And I find this a little more critical on his cleans than the leads. It sounds great with the wah pedal engaged, but I kind of keep a 2 at a time rule for myself, whether it be in front of the amp or behind the amp, not including the drive pedal. So I find if you do, say, a wah pedal chorus and a reverb, it can start to get a little bit muddy, so I tend to turn one of those off. The time-based effects you can kind of get away with a little bit more as far as the echo stuff, but I wouldn't engage all of these at the same time. But for stuff like cleans, you can do a chorus. Rotary doesn't sound bad even with the chorus as well, and delay and get a little bit more usability out of it that way, but I tend to stick to about 2 to make it sound proper. I'm going to skip the amp and cab for a second, because these we'll spend some time on, and talk about delay. So all of this has pretty much always been on Zakk's pedal board. He's always had a wah pedal, whether it be the original Crybaby, then his signature, always had a rotary vibe, or Univibe used to be the original, then he has a signature. Again, the phaser, drive, chorus used to be Boss stuff, except for this was also Dunlop, and then now he has all the Dunlop MXR products now. Recently, he's been using a delay, and well, I can't speak to the last tour because I was like front row on the show I saw him on recently, but I couldn't see the end of his pedal board. I can only see the side with the wah pedal and that sort of stuff. So the last tour, though, I know he was using a carbon copy, MXR carbon copy delay before the amp, and it's one of those things that I can't really tell where he uses it live. On the album, there's some, parts with echo where I can't tell if it's post-processing, they put in the DAW, but regardless, I ended up just, well, that didn't need that, ended up throwing it behind the amp because this is one of those ones that was impossible to tame. Even at 1% mix, it was just so loud as far as the delay goes, so I ended up throwing it back here. So this is, again, analog mono. How much this translates to a carbon copy, I don't know, but it sounds pretty good. And the final effect, probably much to the relief of the CPU, is some studio reverb. This is something that I know for a fact is not on Zakk's pedal, but there's definitely some times that, whether it be on solos or cleans, that it sounds like some reverb's added in post on the record. So threw that in there, take advantage of the processing power, and get some good fractal audio reverb there. Finally, let's talk about the meat of the preset, and probably apparent to some of you, the elephant in the room. So these 3 blocks are really your Zakk Wylde sound. You grab a Gibson type guitar with EMGs, throw a super overdrive or equivalent in front of this amp and this cabinet, you're going to sound pretty damn close. Okay, so what's the amp? Well, for the amp type, I selected the Friedman HBE, which is kind of the higher gain version of the BE, pretty much same. All of these are the same amp. I think one of them is like a non-production version that Fractal Audio had, or some special version that sounded a little bit better. Whatever the case, I like that one the best out of V1, V2. So that's why I chose that. As you know, or probably know, Zakk Wylde uses Marshalls, or used Marshalls. Now he's using Wild Audio amps, which I'm assuming are pretty much Marshall clones. They sound like overdriven, supercharged JCM 800s. Friedmans are not Marshalls. Friedmans are Friedmans. They are kind of a boutique supercharged Marshall on their own though. And as far as plexi amps goes, they are among my favorites because so many of great guitarists use them, including we got the Friedman Butterslacks that Mastodon's Bill Kelleher uses, amazing sounding amp, and it's one of those things that I wouldn't use personally, but I love a good Friedman amp sound. So that's why I chose that. Now, you could pick from a couple different other options. So we have Brit 800, 34 mod, and regular. And these are your JCM 800 models. I started using the mod, but it sounds more old school, late 80s, early 90s Zakk to me. It's not a bad sound, and if it works for you, that's great. 34 is almost closer to the overdriven, just balls to the walls Marshall sound that Black Label Society uses, but there's a lot of that distorted, just pushed overtones that I don't like. It's hard to describe unless you hear it. And it's a very famous mod where the name escapes me right now. But this is supposed to sound something like the Marshall that Slash used. And just none of these really did it for me. So between the gain and the muddiness, I just didn't like any of them. So I ventured over to the Friedman stuff, tried some Splon, some other different types of, plexi amps, and ended up settling on this. And I think it sounds pretty good. So let's start from the back, and we'll work our way up front. That didn't save from last time. That's interesting. So I'm going to show you a trick that I haven't done yet. Anyway, so I'm going to turn the speaker compression up a little bit. I'm going to turn the speaker drive up just a tad because this is really, really sensitive. So let's do 0.66 just for fun. And speaker compression, probably good at 1. Let's try that. I think I remember turning these down to 0 for that lead part, but regardless, what these do is simulate another aspect of speaker cabinet. So the speaker drive, if you push this all the way up, it's going to distort and it's going to sound like absolute garbage. So I'll give you an example. So as long as you keep it below a certain threshold, it sounds really realistic because, that's what power amps do. They do make the speakers drive so hard at a certain volume that it just craps out. You don't get a real sound out of it. And that's kind of what the first distorted guitar tone was a broken speaker. So I like to turn that up a little bit, and because Zakk's shows are just so freaking unbelievably loud, makes sense. So I turn that up a little bit, and as a side effect of that, the speaker also compresses a little bit to where you don't get as much dynamics. Once you're at a certain volume, the percent difference between the loudest note and the softest note just it decreases exponentially. So I'm also going to turn that up a little bit. Sounds pretty good for Zakk stuff, and it really makes it to where you don't have to do a whole lot if you record this sound. You might want to maximize your overall mix or whatever, but you don't have to touch the guitar as much because you already have a really consistent sound, which is nice. You want to keep the speaker, all that the same. Power supply is good. For power amp, the default tubes are EL34s, as are most plexi style amps. Zakk uses 6550s, which are bass power amp tubes traditionally. And all of his old Marshalls were modded with them. I'm assuming his new stuff is still using them. That's because they're one of the flatter power tubes. The only one that sounds more full and has that high frequency and low frequency bump that I love are KT88s. 66s kind of, and 6L6s, they kind of have that lower mid-range bump that I like for metal, but 6550s are among those power tubes that take a long time to distort when you push it, and it makes perfect sense when Zakk's using already just ridiculously overdriven preamp sound. So he always uses 6550s, and that's what we're going to use. Keeping everything else the same will bring us to this basic screen, and this is where things aren't going to play apples to a regular Marshall, but we're going to try to get close. Input drive. Supposedly, Zakk cranks his stuff to 10 all the time. I don't know. Don't necessarily believe that. For this instance, I did. The problem with that is the Friedman, especially this HBE model, is so much more high gain than regular JCM 800s that it's just ridiculous. So in order to get a similar type of behavior, I just pushed down on the input trim a little bit, down to 0.4. And could I have just driven this back? Yeah, it's pretty much the same difference, but it looks more pleasing to the eye, so I kept it that way. What else isn't the same? You got the bass, mid, and treble. Supposedly, again, Zakk keeps his stuff at 10 on treble, almost 10 on bass, a lot of times supposedly supposed to be 10, and no mids. He's like the stereotypical heavy metal meme guitarist where you push bass and treble and no mids. But on a Marshall amp for modern sounding guitars, that makes sense because they're very, very mid heavy for that kind of stuff. Still trying to match different album sounds that didn't sound perfect to me, so I backed down on the bass. Mids are up at around 3, and treble sounded pretty good at 10. And if you're switching between different albums, you're going to get different sounds. So 1919 Eternal, I found sounded better when you push down on the mids a little bit, turn up the presence, back off of the bass. For Blessed Hell Ride, it was the opposite, and even treble could stand to come down a little bit. And on his newer albums, much more mid-heavy, less thumpy, more of a traditional mid-heavy guitar tone. So this you'll have to play with as far as the tone stack goes, depending on which era of Zakk sound you're going for. And then presence, in my experience, didn't need a whole lot of that, so I just bumped it up until it sounded right on the high end, and that's all going to depend on your cabinets anyway. And because the Marshalls don't actually have a depth parameter, I just turned it up until it sounded, like proper bass response. So this is kind of going to give you your low mids to lows, and this is going to be your sub and bass frequencies. The same thing here, except on your high end. So presence is the only thing that among these two that are on actual Marshalls, though, so this one's a bit more authentic. Everything else I turned off. I didn't think this needed a bright cap. It's already ridiculously overdriven and has plenty of high end in to my ears, so that's what I'm rocking, and you are more than welcome to change stuff in the EQ, the loop, or different parameters here if you're going for a different era of his sound. Now you're free to go over here and try some of these JCM 800 models, but what really pushed me over the edge was trying to get the right cabinet sound. And I found that basically none of my ideas that I tried worked well with those JCM 800 models. So I experimented some more and finally got to this point where I was pretty happy with it. So it's one of those things where just because you have one piece of the puzzle right, if you get anything else, on the other side of that puzzle, they don't necessarily play right together. So it can actually sound better if you get two wrong pieces. In this case, two wrongs do make more of a right, in my opinion. So we're using two cabinet impulse responses. We're using a 1960B and 1960A Marshall cab, both 4x12s, the B with V30s, and the A with G12s. Now, Zakk only used the G12s on early Aussie records. I think it was only No Rest for the Wicked. I'm pretty sure by the time that No More Tears came around, he had switched from that. And if he didn't, it was very soon after that. But he found the Electro Voice EVM 12L speakers on tour when he went to replace some broken G12s and fell in love with them. And they're kind of seen as like this holy grail speaker for clean guitarists, for like jazz guitarists, some blues players and that sort of stuff that isn't too overdriven, because they're fairly flat response. I mean, it doesn't sound like an amp without a speaker cabinet. But as far as like having a mid hump or, stuff like V30s have that concentration in the mids, every speaker has their own sound, but the EVMs are fairly flat, and Zakk really likes them, and he has signatures of that now. Problem is, there is no Electro Voice speaker models anywhere in the AX8, and I'm hoping that since the AX8 3 is going to have like 2,000 freaking speaker models, that they'll be among there. And I searched for some freebies, couldn't find any, and I think Own Hammer and a couple other sites have some like $5 to $15 packs for them, and I wasn't going to gamble on it. So anyway, my whole shtick with this series, I want everything to be on the AX8, and you guys don't have to download anything to make it work. So what I figured was, why not combine some cab impulse responses until I get kind of a balancing effect where one of them bumps cancel out the troughs in the other speaker model. And what ended up happening is two Marshall cabinets, which is what Zakk uses, or pretty much the same thing, and the V30s and G12s pretty much complement each other and soothe out each other's missing frequencies. And makes sense because a lot of guitarists like to mix and match in an X configuration on their cabinets where they'll have V30s and G12s in them, or another different type of speaker like T75 or whatever. So I'll mute one and then use the other and then use them at the same time. You can see why I ended up choosing this combination. So I think that works out pretty well, and if, again, you're trying to dial in a specific album sound, then you can mix and match the levels on these before you touch even the amp's preamp. If I were recording this, which I have, I would pan them left and right 100%, record them separately, and then mix to your ear's desire. So that works pretty well, and does mimic the EVM speakers fairly decently, although if you're able to get your own, your hands on your own impulse response, and I would recommend definitely trying it out and see how nice it plays. So that's basically Zakk sound in a nutshell. You really got an overdriven Marshall through some flat speakers. Everything else is time-based effects or his own special signature pedals. So it's one of those guitar tones that personally I don't like. If I try to play my own stuff on it, or even just jamming, or sitting and practicing scales or whatever, it sounds like shit to my ears. But you put it in a mix and you play pentatonics and pinched harmonics, and it's just freaking crushing and still remains one of my favorite guitar tones from someone, and yet I don't like it objectively for my own stuff. So I'll quote one of the commenters on this channel. Someone said, Zakk's the epitome of I love the way he does it, I just wouldn't do it myself, and that's kind of how I feel. So works great. You put this on a thumpy bass guitar and some punchy drums, and you're gonna have a pretty good time, I think. So that's Zakk Wylde's AX8 patch. If you have any questions, comments, let me know in the comments below, and we'll try to look into some more bands and stuff here in the near future. Thanks for watching. Bye.